Thank you and welcome to FCA International's November Safety Call. FCA updated its silica programs for paint, drywall, floor, and light industrial. For those that already have one, no substantive changes were needed. For those who don't have one, visit finishingcontractors.org and search for silica to find them all. And with that, we welcome Mike Hartman, a safety professional with AmeriSafe, to take us through today's presentation. Thanks for being with us today, Mike.
No problem. Thank you for the kind introduction, John. Hello, everybody. And today we're going to talk about respiratory protection. This is a very important matter when we're talking about the finishing trades. We often are putting material into the air or dealing with other material that has some hazards to our employees. So it's important that we go ahead and make sure we're doing those right things that are required to protect our employees in the long term. So as always, I want to make sure you're aware that the FCA Safety Helpline is available for you to call. If you call the 844 number and reach out, we'll return that phone call, or reach out with an email via the Safety Helpline at finishingcontractors.org. Either way, you get generally me answering your question. And I'm a pretty decent safety professional. Any issues that I'm not aware of, I have a staff that I can reach out to get more specific answers when necessary. All right, so no further ado, let's see what OSHA says about respiratory protection. What do we need to do as employers? Well, first of all, we need to develop that written program, determine who's going to oversee that program, and make sure that we've documented that within our written program. We need to protect or select respirators that are proper for what exposures we're going to have. We need to conduct those medical evaluations prior to putting people into respirators, provide that fit testing and training, and then evaluate our users' ability to do that correctly. Are they correctly wearing it? Are they correctly storing it? And are you correcting those deficiencies? Then we have to provide for the maintenance, storage, and cleaning of respirators. And last, we have to retain all those medical records. So let's talk a little bit about each of these. We'll start with developing a written program. And on the right, you can see the FCA Safety Manual. We have this available on finishingcontractors.org if you want to download a copy. It has a lot of different programs, and one of those programs is the respirator program. Now, OSHA in 1910 has a flow chart for determining what type of respiratory program you need. So, if we start at the top, are we above the PEL, right? That's that first question. Are the respirators necessary to protect the health of the employees? So if we do require them, then obviously we need a respirator program. However, if we do not have any exposures above the PEL, we may or may not need a program. If we provide those dust masks or respirators voluntarily for those who are not being exposed above the PEL, then we still have steps to take. OSHA has an appendix on it. Appendix D is at the end of 1910 134. Which is the respiratory protection standard. And if you provide those voluntary face or filtering face pieces, aka N95, aka dust mask, then we do need to have our employees fill out a Appendix D. All right, and the Appendix D is pretty straightforward. It just make sure that the employee understands what a respirator will do and won't do, and that they are not being exposed over that permissible exposure limit, which is the limit that OSHA says we can breathe in over an 8-hour time-weighted average each day. There's not a need for a respiratory program in relation to it, although a voluntary respirator program is not out of line. If we're not providing those dust masks, and there's not a respiratory hazard, then we don't need to do anything, right? We can provide those users with that Appendix D, but if we're not providing those, then we don't have as much of a requirement. All right, so next we have the person that has to oversee the program. Now, here you see a little excerpt from the FCA Safety Manual and Respiratory Protection Standard. Under roles and responsibilities, one of those roles is Program Administrator. And you can see in the, when we first get this from FCA, it does not have all the information filled in. And here we have highlighted responsible person, where somebody's name must go, right? Somebody needs to be in charge of that program. We need to have an administrator. And that administrator's job is to make sure we fulfilled all the responsibilities laid on us by OSHA in this standard. Right, so identifying where we need to wear respirators, where those hazards are, evaluating those hazards to determine when it's required and when it's not, choosing which are the right respiratory protections to use, and monitoring to make sure that our employees are using them correctly, right? Making sure that they're being used the way they were designed, including ensuring proper storage and maintenance. I don't know how many times I've gone into a facility and seen respirators hanging from the edge of a mini baker or sitting on top of a gang box, and that's just not proper storage. We have to make sure that we do the training. We have to make sure we do that either qualitative or quantitative fit testing. We'll go into that a little bit later. You're the administrator of the medical surveillance program. You're in charge of maintaining those medical records, evaluating the program, and updating that program as necessary. So there's a lot of responsibilities that go for that program administrator, but that program administrator does need to be defined. So how do we select the right respirator? This really comes down to how much of an exposure we have. We're generally going to go with a half mask respirator or a filtering face piece respirator that provide protections up to 10 times the PEL. So as long as we're not exceeding that PEL by 10 times, a half mask respirator will work, right? In most situations. If we're having a higher exposure than that 10 times, we may need to move to that full face respirator. We also have to look at which filters we'll be using, right? Because not all filters are created equal. Here on the left, you see a 3M NIOSH with the black band. That is for VOCs, right? Organic compounds that clears with carbon. And down below it, you see a one with a green band. And the green band is going to be an acid cartridge, which takes acidic materials out of it. Not all filters are created equal. They're not all going to take out everything you need. So I can remember a job that I was on in the early aughts, and we were working on a data processing center, and we had a trench that needed to be painted with a 3-part epoxy. We had to do it at night when nobody else was there because we knew it was going to be a pretty noxious odor coming from it. Well, I remember about 10 minutes in, there was a couple of apprentices, me and another journeyman, and about 10 minutes in, he started belting out the bass line for Anagata Devita. And I found myself screaming the song, the lyrics of that song at the top of my lungs, at which point in time I realized something was wrong. What the filters we had were not taking care of the hazard we were exposed to. So we all got out of that area and waited until we were sober enough to drive back. Right? We want to make sure we do not put our employees in this type of situation. If it had not been for Anagata Devita, we may not have noticed how impaired we were at that point in time. So it's really important that we look and find out what type of filters work best. So how do you tell what filter you should be using? And when should we be making this determination? I'd suggest using the SDS. If you look at section 8 of the SDS of any material, it will tell you what exposure controls you should use and what PPE you should be using. And that includes what type of respirator cartridge would be utilized for that specific material. Now, when should we be doing this? We should be doing this during the planning stages. We know what materials we'll be using. We know which materials we commonly use. Those materials, we can imagine we've already looked at the SDS and have the correct ones, right? If we haven't done that, then we can go through and make sure that the SDSs for our common materials are covered by the filters that we generally utilize, right? But when we order a material that is outside of what we normally utilize, we need to be checking that PPE on the SDS before we send that material on site. We need to make sure that we have those proper protections, the correct filters, that we've gone ahead and talked to our foreman and they're aware of what's going to be needed to protect. There are going to be some instances where a purifying respirator will not work, right? Sometimes we need to have an atmosphere supplying respirator, right? An air line, one that's going to provide that oxygen. So this happens a lot in industrial applications when we're using a, not a sandblasting, abrasive blasting. We are generally required to have that air supplying. Also, if we're working in an atmosphere that does not have enough oxygen, we also need to make sure we have that atmosphere supplying respirator. There's other respirators that can be used as well, right? There's the PAPR, the powered air purifying respirator. This is a air purifying respirator, just like the half mask and the full mask, but it has a fan in it and a belt unit that pulls that air in and does a lot of the breathing for us. This can be very useful if you have an employee that cannot shave for religious reasons, right? Or if we have somebody that we sent to a fit test and they do not have the health or medical clearance and they do not have the health to be able to don a respirator, but they still want to work and you still want to employ them. In that case, a PAPR, which is a loose fitting respirator, doesn't require as much. That initial medical evaluation needs to be performed before we put somebody in a respirator. This is really important. A respirator takes more effort to breathe through than not having a respirator. If we put somebody into a respirator without that medical evaluation, we may put more strain on the cardiovascular system than their cardiovascular system can take, right? And in that case, we might cause more harm by putting them in a respirator than not. So it's important that prior to putting anyone into a respirator, that we provide them that medical questionnaire evaluation, that we send that in, that we perform that pulmonary function test for a baseline. And we need to make sure that we get that information to a qualified medical practitioner to determine if our employee is healthy enough. So the initial medical evaluation is going to let the employee answer these questions, and we need to let them do it during normal working hours, right? Or a time or a place that is convenient. That's part of the standard language. We need to make sure that that employee is provided this information in a way that's convenient, that we maintain that confidentiality. Right? There is protections here from HIPAA laws and other issues. We need to make sure that that information is kept secure, right? That means that you're not looking at that information that you're sending into the doctor, right? That medical professional. I think that the standard says licensed healthcare professional is really what they're looking for. And when we send that form in to a licensed healthcare professional, we're not allowed to review that questionnaire. We're not allowed to read the answers that the employee put in there. Right? So we need to make sure that we have that system developed so that we can make sure we protect our employees' information. Once we have that medical clearance, we perform a fit test. And there's a couple of different types of fit tests we can do. We can do a qualitative or a quantitative. Right? The qualitative is one where we're going to use irritant smoke. Right? There's a passage that is in the FCA Safety and Health Manual. There's a procedure for performing a qualitative fit test, including what passages to read and what the tests involve. Right? Which is generally looking up, looking down, looking left, looking right, all the while somebody is spraying irritant smoke at them, asking them to recite a passage of poetry. You know, I generally go with the alphabet instead of the passage of poetry, but to each their own. And that works pretty well. However, there's also the quantitative fit test. And the quantitative fit test gives you an actual indication of how much leakage there is in the mask. And this can be very useful, right? This is quantitative, has the numbers, data really well defined, as opposed to the qualitative, which is more of if they can smell it or react to that irritant smoke, then we know. So we need to make sure that we provide that on an annual basis. Every year they are getting that fit test. There are other times when we need to have that fit test as well. If somebody has major dental work that affects the shape of their face, a fit test may be required. If somebody loses a large amount of weight, again, changing the contours of the face, or takes a facial injury that changes the contours of the face, then we need to make sure we perform that fit test again. We also are required to train them in how to use that respirator, right? We have to make sure they know how to use it, how to clean it, how to store it, how to maintain it, what it will protect them from, what it won't protect them from. And we need to do that before they first wear that respirator. And we also need to do it annually, right? So we should have an annual cycle set up that we're performing the medical questionnaire, we're performing the fit test, and we're performing that training. So one of the responsibilities laid out by OSHA is to evaluate respirator users and correct deficiency. And that means it's your responsibility to make sure they are performing the correct tests. Right? Make sure that they are exerting those safe behaviors that you're looking for. Are they performing a positive and negative pressure check every time they put on their respirator? Are they wearing it correctly? Right? Is it secured in? Do we have everything the way it's supposed to be, nice and tight, so we have that seal? And how to store it. Because I know in my time in the field, everybody, well, almost everybody kept their respirator in their grip, right? They kept a respirator in grip. I didn't see many in the way of plastic bags or anything to keep other contaminants from the inside of that mask. So we need to make sure that our employees are storing, cleaning, and maintaining their respirators correctly. Another thing we need to bring up is that we do not alter, abuse, or misuse a respirator. I'm sure if I went around the room, some of you might be able to tell me a story similar to the one I'm going to share, where I know I had a foreman early on in my apprenticeship that had taken one of the respirator cartridges out so he could fit a cigar through that hole and smoke while spraying. You know, he thought it was a pretty good deal, but it really wasn't. Right? It wasn't doing its job anymore once we compromise it. Now, I think that sounds a little more ridiculous to see that in today's work environment is really unlikely, but still, we need to make sure that when we see those deficiencies that we're correcting them. And as always, with the standard from OSHA, the best way to prove that you've corrected it is by documenting the corrections, right? Documenting those safety disciplinary actions when necessary. We also need to make sure that our employees are clean shaven, right? Respirators are not going to work with a beard. It's going to limit the efficiency of that respirator. When you can't get a good seal, you can't stop the air from coming in through routes other than the filters. So the CDC is nice enough to provide us with a facial hairstyles and filtering face piece respirators. Yeah, nice little demonstration of which facial hair we're allowed to wear. I know when I was in the field, I usually went with the clean shaven look. Maybe because I couldn't grow much in the way of facial hair, but it was mostly clean shaven look when I was there, right? The painter's brush, I think, is pretty, right in line with the Finishing Contractors Association. That's what I think all painters should be wearing, but I desist. Okay, so providing care for that respirator. We need to make sure that our employees are inspecting their respirator before they use it and when they're cleaning. They have to make sure that those seals are still in good condition, right? Those seals, they break down, they get damaged, they get ripped. And when they do, that respirator is not going to work correctly, right? We want to make sure we don't have a buildup of material that affects our seal and affects whether or not the respirator is working correctly. When we have full face respirators, we also need to make sure that that glass is clean so we can see. So the manufacturer is going to spell out how to do that cleaning, right? That sanitation. And there's also an appendix B2 in the OSHA standard for respiratory protection that lays out what that proper cleaning and sanitizing requirement is. So one of the ways we can provide this is by having 3M wipes that we can utilize on site to perform that cleaning. We should be providing that time to clean our respirators on a weekly basis when we're utilizing them daily so that those respirators stay clean. And then for storage, we need to protect them from damage and avoid that deformation, right? We need to make sure that it's in an airtight bag so that we don't get material in it. So a Rubbermaid container, a Ziploc bag, as long as we have that protection that isn't going to deform that face piece, are the options that work really well. As far as citations related to respirator storage, this is low-hanging fruit for OSHA. In OSHA, when they see a N95 dust mask on the ground, that is an improperly stored respirator, right? When we have a half mask hanging from a mini baker or sitting in a gang box or sitting in a grip without that airtight container and protection, that is going to be a citation. So make sure that we're aware of that and that we're training up our people to make sure that they're protecting themselves from the exposure of getting material into that respirator and protecting you, the employer, from those citations. Another thing that we need to make sure we're aware of is keeping those medical records, right? We're required to keep medical records for 30 years beyond the employee's term of employment. So we need to keep that 30 years after they're done. And this includes the medical evaluation, right? And it includes the most recent fit test. So the medical evaluation is generally something you will have to negotiate with your medical provider. And medical providers as a whole generally will maintain your medical records related to those because they have a lot of the same requirements. But it's important that we clarify that we know what that agreement is so that we can be sure we can provide those records when required. So once again, these are the requirements that OSHA lays out in this. Developing a written program. Right? Developing a written program is pretty easy. I imagine most of you already have one. If you do not, FCA offers a good written program for respiratory protection, along with the vast majority, if not all, of the other hazards you may face. Right? So if you don't have one, reach out to FCA and get your manual. You have to assign a person to oversee that program, documenting who that person that's overseeing it, who's that administrator. That needs to be documented in your program. So I know I showed you that highlight of where that would be in the FCA manual. Any other respiratory protection manual needs to have an administrator in their roles and responsibilities saying who it is and what they are responsible for. We need to make sure that we select the proper respirators, right? Conduct those medical evaluations prior to putting somebody into a respirator, provide fit test and training prior to use and annually if changes occur, or if the users show they're not using it correctly, right? So if they demonstrate a lack of competence, time to retrain. That's true of respirators as it is of any other hazards that people are dealing with, right? That's pretty much a go-to. When do we need to retrain? When employees are showing a lack of competence. Evaluate respirator users and correct deficiencies. We need to make sure that we are out there checking that our employees are doing it correctly, right? Coach them in the field when we need to, make sure our foremen are aware of what we're looking for and that they are looking for it as well. Provide for the maintenance, storage, and cleaning of respirators, right? If we do not have a good place to do that cleaning on the job site, then we need to make sure that we provide for that cleaning, whether that is 3M respirator wipes and the time to do so, or getting that running water, that slop sink, so they can get to that as well. And then retaining and providing access to specific records. Medical records employees are able to see, right? So if they requested of you, you need to make sure that you provide that to them within a reasonable amount of time. I believe when it comes to medical records, you have 24 hours to give them a copy of that medical record from when they ask, right? 24 hours, business days only. So that's what the standard says. Does anybody have any questions to any of these points and requirements? Anyone? Bueller?
I got a
All right.
question here. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, Joe. How's it going
Okay.
today?
You said specifically when we send the assessment, as in the employer. Now, I know that there are some scenarios where the employee might be sending that, and I'm open for what your commentary could be on either method, because you could get in a sticky situation where they fail to send it, and then you're like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do? Because you're supposed to have that before work.
Well, it's not all that sticky a situation, except that you may be down a person at work that day. It is definitely possible for them to send theirs in. Like I said, we need to make sure that we are protecting that information and not reading through that information. So even if you're sending it in as the employer, if they didn't want to fill it out and just gave you a blank sheet, you can end up in that same situation. But what it comes down to is if that employee does not, if we do not have that information back from your licensed healthcare professional saying that this person is healthy enough to wear a respirator, we can't perform the fit test. Right? If we look at that fit test form that OSHA provides, right at the top of it says this person has passed medical clearance for this. So either way that it's being performed, that whether they're sending in or you're sending it in, we need to have that medical clearance. Now, Beth asked the question, what if our union does the testing? Should we be in charge of the medical records as well? It's an interesting question, Beth. You have the responsibility to have medical clearances provided. Now, those medical clearances could come through the union, but they have to be from a licensed healthcare professional, right? So should you be in charge of those medical records as well? As the employer, you are obligated to be able to provide them to OSHA or to the employee if asked. So since you are required to be able to provide them, you should be in charge of those medical records as well. Does that answer your question, Beth?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Beth. All right.
So I got to follow up to that.
Yep, go ahead.
In essence, if we're handling their information and sending it in for them, we just need to use the same personnel in an office that would be responsible for things like claims processing, L&I, and all that sort of stuff.
I would suggest you process it through your same HR area, right? Those who are, you're trusted and experienced handling sensitive information, and yet they are still not allowed to read them, right? They're not allowed to see what answers were put in by the employee.
Cool, thanks.
You're welcome. Ooh, the chat is blowing up. Okay, so Michaela asks, if someone uses the same model of respirator, do you still need to update the test every year? Every year we need to send out the medical questionnaire, right? The medical evaluation comes that first year we're putting in. And then after we have that medical evaluation, we send in that questionnaire to a licensed healthcare professional that tells us whether or not we need to redo that pulmonary test. And if someone uses the same model of respirator, that doesn't change the requirements. We still have to conduct a medical evaluation, provide fit testing each year. All right. You're welcome, Michaela. Anybody else with any questions? If not, then I'll move on to what are some of the hazards that we're dealing with, right? We have to deal with respirable crystalline silica, right? Whether we're talking about, as this example shows, sanding, right? Sanding drywall compound. We have a PEL of 0.05 micrograms per cubic meter or milligrams per cubic meter, right? That's our PEL for it. And if we're exposing people over that PEL, we need to provide respiratory protection, right? I kind of left this in with our different methods of controlling because our respirator should never be our first step for protecting our employees. We should use engineering and administrative controls to eliminate those hazards as much as we can prior to putting somebody into a respirator, right? So when it comes to sanding, drywall, pulse sanding versus hand sanding, that's an administrative control. We've changed the way that we've done the work, and that can really limit it. When we start adding a vacuum into it, that becomes more of an engineering control, right? So, and that's going to control it even better. It's going to eliminate that exposure, which really limits our own exposure to that as an employer and our employees' exposure to the hazard. So ideally, we want to make sure we're looking at engineering solutions, administrative solutions before we look at PPE. And then when we've removed as much hazard as we can, then we put in PPE. Now, two controls that are not put on here are actually better than engineering and administrative, and that's elimination or substitution. Right? If we can eliminate the hazard from the material, then we end up in a better place. Right? So if we can eliminate our content that has silica content in the taping compound and go to one that doesn't, then we've really reduced that hazard. Right? We've really eliminated it from it. If we can substitute it for one that has less of the silica content, or perhaps something that is still hazardous but not as hazardous, right? A good example of substitution is when they took lead out of most paints and provided not a safe paint, right? But a paint without that lead exposure. It still had hazards, but the hazards weren't the same and weren't as much. So we need to make sure that we work through our hierarchy of controls, starting with elimination, substitution, then going to engineering and administrative. And whatever hazard is left over after we've gotten rid of as much as we can, we use a respirator protectant. So with respirocrystalline silica, even if we were to take all of the silica out of our taping compound, do we still have a hazard there? And the answer is yes. Right, the answer to that, well, there we go, is nuisance dust. Right? Nuisance dust is something that we still have a PEL for. And nuisance dust is pretty much any particulate that doesn't have any harmful effects itself. Right? There's not any specific harmful effects to the lungs from this specific dust. Right? But when we expose ourselves to enough from it, we still have long-term damage, right? So OSHA says that the PEL for nuisance dust is 15 milligrams per cubic meter time weight, right? So we need to make sure that we protect from that. What kind of exposure is that? OSHA shows in the same example as what I showed up above is what some of those exposures are, total dust exposures. Right, we saw that we're a little bit over the PEL by hand sanding without any other controls above the silica requirement. But we're also almost 10 times above the nuisance dust exposure limit when we do that hand sanding without any other controls. Right, so using that pole mounted sander, we really limit that, but we're still up above that total dust exposure. So we need to make sure that we're looking out for nuisance dust as well. And of course, lead, right? Lead is an issue that we deal with whenever we are, impacting existing paint. Right, existing paint is going to be a lead hazard when we're dealing with existing glazing on windows. We can end up with a lead hazard there as well. So we need to make sure we're removing that exposure down below 50 micrograms per cubic meter when it comes to lead. Right, and there's a bunch of other requirements beyond respiratory protection that goes into that lead standard. But it's important that we utilize that respiratory protection as well. And then other respiratory hazards that we deal with specifically, you have 3 hazards that are called out within the standards and have direct standards related to them. One is methylene chloride, right? So paint stripper, for utilizing those, you have some serious respiratory hazards related to that. Cadmium, which is going to be in yellow and red pigments, and then benzene, right? So each of these have a specific standard that goes into what are the requirements to deal with when we're exposing our employees to it. And on top of this, we have our everyday organic compounds, right? Our VOCs that we don't want to breathe in, right? When we have even latex that doesn't have those VOCs, breathing in that material is hazardous. So make sure that you're doing your pre-planning. Make sure you are looking at this at the point in time before we're ordering that material and sending it out to the job, right? During our bidding process, when we look and see that we have a different material, we need to make sure that we know what the protection is for that. So if we're going to require a different type of cartridge, or we're going to require an air supplied hood for this task, knowing that ahead of time allows us to bid that job in a way that we can still make that profit and protect our employees. Additionally, if you get that, if you have that reputation for doing the extra work to make sure you're doing it safely, that's something that general contractors like. And if you can point out to a general contractor that the reason you're 10% over is because they aren't considering the protections required for this aspect of that task, and they're going to come back because of that, right? That can really help build that relationship. And with that, that's all the material I have to cover today. But I am definitely available to answer any questions, either right now or going forward. If you think of it later, FCA Safety Helpline is a really good place to go to get that information. When you have a question, you need some advice, you need some expert opinion, this is a great place to get that. Any questions?
All right.
It looks like I have one up in chat. Okay, so Joseph wants to know about Appendix D for N95s. So N95 dust masks or face filter or filtering face piece is a respirator as far as OSHA is concerned. If it has the two straps and is marked with the N95 marking on it, they consider that a respirator. So what Appendix D is for when we have employees that do not wear respirators normally, right? They are not exposed above a PEL. So we have no requirement to have them wear it. But sometimes employees will want to wear a dust mask to protect themselves, even if it's below the PEL. And that's a pretty reasonable desire, right? When we do that, we need to make sure that we provide them the correct information. For an Appendix D, for that voluntary usage of a respirator, we do not need to provide medical clearance, right? We do not need to provide a fit test. All of those requirements that go with having a respiratory protection program for employees that will be exposed at or above the PEL aren't really involved for voluntary usage. So you're allowed to provide them respirators for their voluntary use as long as they're not exposed above it. And then they do not require that fit test or that medical clearance. But they are required to review that Appendix D form on an annual basis, and you should have them sign it and keep it in your records on an annual basis to make sure you have that. And Joseph says it's as simple as providing an employee orientation manual. And I agree, right? It can be part of that, but really you want a signature showing that they've done it. Now, one of the ways you can do that is through toolbox talks, or, make sure that we're getting that covered.
All right, good stuff, Mike. I know I was certainly looking forward to this topic today, just based on all the complexities, not just getting the right fit with the equipment, but also all the record keeping, everything behind it. There's a lot more to it than just getting that right fit. So great talk today. I really appreciate it. And thank you everybody who participated in the discussion as well, or just being on the call. I appreciate everybody's participation.
And I really like those questions, so keep them coming.
Yep.
Right?
And like Mike said, if you have any more, certainly reach out, safety helpline at finishingcontractors.org. So that line is there for you guys. So With that, Mike, thank you once again. All the participants, thank you. And being November, everybody have a fantastic Thanksgiving and a safe one as well. Take care.
All right. Thank you all.